Today, we're diving into a story that's just incredible. We're talking about a nation that is swimming in oil but is absolutely drowning in crisis. A nation that just saw its president literally removed from power by a foreign military. We're talking about Venezuela. So, picture this. It's January 3rd, 2026. You wake up to a headline that feels like it's ripped straight from a Hollywood movie. The United States military has just launched an operation and taken Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro out of office. Just like that. The world is still trying to figure out what happens next. So you have to be asking, right? How on earth did it come to this? To really get it, we've got to look back at the long, really painful road that pushed Venezuela right to the edge. Okay, so let's start with what happened right after the operation. Because honestly, it created a situation on the ground that was just chaotic and confusing for everyone involved. So Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, they were arrested, put on a plane to New York, and charged with narco-terrorism. And back in Venezuela, boom, a massive power vacuum. Now, here's where it gets really weird. The U.S. starts saying that the Venezuelan vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is now working with them, even while U.S. soldiers are still on the ground. It was this bizarre, messy setup that had pretty much everyone asking, wait, who's actually in charge here? And then, as if things weren't confusing enough, came this absolute bombshell from U.S. President Donald Trump. He was incredibly blunt about it. He said the United States would be, and I'm quoting here, running Venezuela for a while. And he didn't hide the main goal, getting access to the country's huge oil reserves. Well, the response from Caracas was immediate and fiery. Vice President Rodriguez, the same person the U.S. said was on their side, she completely rejected the whole thing. She said Venezuela would never be a U.S. colony. And right there in those two quotes, you see the entire conflict in a nutshell. Two totally opposite ideas for what Venezuela's future should be. Of course, an intervention this big, this dramatic, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. To really understand why it happened, we have to look at the years and years of crisis that brought this nation to its knees. Just take a second to let this number sink in. 7.7 million. That is the number of Venezuelans who have packed up and fled their own country since 2014. That's 20% of the entire population. We're talking about one of the biggest displacement crises in modern history, all because people were desperately looking for food, for safety, for any kind of future. And here's the economic nightmare that drove them out. Between 2014 and 2021, Venezuela's economy didn't just shrink, it imploded. It contracted by a mind-blowing 75%. This wasn't a recession, it was a total system failure. Hyperinflation made their money worthless and left millions of people in absolute poverty. So how did this happen? Well, it didn't happen overnight. You can trace it back to 1999 with Hugo Chavez and his Bolivian Revolution, which nationalized major industries. After he died, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, slowly started taking apart the country's democracy. He sidelined the parliament when the opposition won it. Then he held a presidential election in 2018 that was widely seen as a fraud. That led the U.S. and dozens of other countries to recognize an opposition leader as the real president, but it never actually forced Maduro out. Now, at the very heart of Venezuela's story, both its incredible wealth and its spectacular collapse, is one single thing. A resource that has been both a gift and, well, a terrible curse: oil. Just look at this. Oil makes up more than 90%, some say as much as 95% of all the money Venezuela makes from exports. The entire economy, the government, social programs, everything was built on oil money. So when oil prices were high, things were great. But when they crashed or when the oil stopped flowing, the whole country went down with it. And the collapse of their oil industry it's a wild story. I mean, think about it. In the 90s, they were pumping out 3.5 million barrels a day. But years of corruption and just terrible mismanagement caused production to plummet. Then the U.S. hit them with sanctions, which just made things worse. By 2026, they were producing a tiny fraction of what they used to, and they were forced to sell most of it to China for cheap. So, now that Maduro is gone, what happens next? Can Venezuela's oil industry actually be saved? And what would it even take to get things back on track? Well, the path forward is daunting, to say the least. The big international oil companies have a pretty clear checklist of what they need before they'll even think about coming back.
First, you've got to clean up the government and root out the corruption. Second, you have to bring back the rule of law so contracts actually mean something. Third, those U.S. sanctions have to be eased. And fourth, the oil laws themselves need a total overhaul to let private companies invest. It's a huge political lift.
And let's talk about the money, because the price tag to fix all this is just astronomical. Just for a small, short-term boost in production, we're talking over $10 billion. But to get back to where they were in the 90s, you're looking at $80 to $90 billion spent over a decade. The country's infrastructure is basically in ruins. It's going to take a generation's worth of investment to rebuild. And we need a serious reality check here. If you look at history, regime change in a big oil country almost never leads to a quick comeback. In fact, in places like Iraq, Iran, and Libya, all the chaos and instability meant that oil production actually went down for years before it even started to recover. But the future of Venezuela isn't just about oil wells and politics. It's about its people, and especially those millions who had no choice but to leave. And this right here might be the country's most valuable untapped resource. The 7.7 million people in the Venezuelan diaspora, they're not just refugees. They are engineers, doctors, business owners, skilled workers. They've spent years out in the world, building networks, saving money, and gaining expertise. If things ever stabilize, they could be the engine that rebuilds the country, bringing back not just money, but skills you just can't put a price on. And all of this brings us back to the biggest question of all for Venezuela. The country is truly at a crossroads. On one side, you've got the largest oil reserves in the world, and this incredible group of talented people abroad who are ready to come home and rebuild. But on the other side, you've got a power vacuum, decades of corruption, and all these global powers with their own agendas. So the question is, will all this oil wealth finally save Venezuela, or will it continue to be its curse? I guess only time will tell.